Hello, welcome to Psych 105, Introduction to Psychology. In this PowerPoint, we will be discussing personality disorders and defense mechanisms. So let's start off with a definition of personality disorders, which are disorders that consist of inflexible, long-standing, maladaptive traits. Just as an aside, if you take the word mal and you look it up in the French dictionary, it means bad. So these are traits that we adapt to, but they're not good traits, they're bad. That cause significantly impaired functioning or great distress in one's personal and social life. Now, what you have to keep in mind about personality disorders is that they are egosyntonic. In other words, the person who is exhibiting these disorders believe they're appropriate behavior, so they don't see anything wrong with the way they're acting. A personality disorder is also enduring, which is meaning it is over a long period of time. And it is inner experiences, behaviors, and the pattern manifests in two or more of the following areas: thinking, feeling, interpersonal relationships, and impulse control. A person must demonstrate significant and enduring difficulties in at least two of these areas. Personality disorders are not usually diagnosed in children because of the requirement that these personality disorders manifest over a time period. So in the DSM-5, we see 10 distinct types of personality disorder: paranoid, schizotypal, borderline, histrionic, narcissistic, avoidant, dependent, obsessive-compulsive, and antisocial. And we're going to be talking about each of these briefly. So when do they begin? The onset of these patterns begin typically during late adolescence and the beginning of adulthood, or as we call it in lifespan psychology, young adulthood. In some very rare instances, they could become clear in childhood. It is unlikely that a psychologist or a psychiatrist would make a diagnosis of a personality disorder before the age of 16 or 17, keeping in mind that the teenage brain is in flux and they already have issues with impulse control and decision making. So a 1999 study of almost 639 New York State families, who they followed for almost 20 years, examined the relationship between childhood experiences of sexual and physical abuse and personality disorder symptoms. And the study found that children with these documented instances of childhood abuse or neglect were more than 4 times as likely to develop a personality disorder in early adulthood, according to the research. So, as many of the psychological components that have been discussed, we always go back to childhood because that's our formative years. That's when we are, in a sense, a lump of clay, and a lot of the experiences we have, not just with our family, but with our peer groups, with our community, really begin to shape who we are as people. So the first one we're going to talk about is paranoid personality disorder. And this is a person who displays a pattern of distrust, suspiciousness, and perceiving others as having an evil motive. They assume that others are out to harm them, take advantage of them, or humiliate them in some way. And they put a lot of effort into protecting themselves and keeping their distance from others. They are known to preemptively attack others whom they feel threatened by. And this is about 4% of the general population. And again, when we look at this population, we're thinking of adults over the age of 18. Somebody who is very paranoid can also fall into the arena of schizophrenia, but that is also accompanied by delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech oftentimes. So, a paranoid personality disorder, somebody who exhibits this can be a fully functioning human being who just doesn't trust anyone. Then we have schizoid personality disorder. And again, this does not specifically relate to schizophrenia, which also involves the hallucinations, delusions, and so forth. The schizoid personality disorder is characterized by a pervasive pattern of social detachment and a restricted range of emotional expression. So when we look at a person like this is somebody who really wants to isolate themselves socially. They don't want relationships, they don't enjoy relationships. They tend to prefer solitary activities, and they don't seem to get a lot of pleasure out of life. The picture on the right-hand side is an artist named Vincent van Gogh, who a lot of post his death recognition has been that he might have suffered from this particular personality disorder. He really preferred a solitary lifestyle. He did have a multitude of mental issues, spent time in an asylum. However, he was happiest when he was alone with his paints and he could just paint. You do not see a lot of people in his paintings other than himself. He couldn't afford models, so he did a lot of still lives, a lot of nature, and a lot of self-portraits. Schizoid personality disorder affects about 3% of the general population. Then you have a schizotypal personality disorder. And this is basically, you take somebody who has paranoid personality disorder, you add in schizoid personality disorder, and you get a schizotypal personality disorder. This is characterized by an acute discomfort in close relationships, distortions in thinking, and very eccentric behavior. Also demonstrates severe social anxiety, paranoia, and other unconventional beliefs. People with this disorder feel extreme discomfort with maintaining close relationships with people, mainly because they think that their peers harbor negative thoughts towards them, so they avoid forming them. So it's that idea of, well, if I am friends with this person and they potentially could be talking about me behind my back, why bother being friends with this person, and why bother being friends with anyone? They tend to have very peculiar speech mannerisms, odd modes of dress, and you see 3 to 5% of the general population with slightly more men diagnosed than women. On the right-hand side, the picture I have is Johnny Depp's portrayal of Willy Wonka, and he is a perfect representation of someone who avoids social relationships because he is inherently odd and paranoid and is not generally accepted as somebody who would fit into society. The next one is borderline personality disorder. And this is somebody whose behavior seems to shift radically in a matter of seconds. They can shift from positive to negative, generally after they feel disappointed or they perceive a threat of losing someone. Their self-image can also change rapidly from extremely positive to extremely negative. This is someone who's feeling good about themselves at 12 o'clock, and at 12:04, one minor comment by a stranger on the street will have them literally believing that they are the worst person on earth. Impulsive behaviors are common, including alcohol or drug abuse, unsafe sex, gambling, and a general sense of recklessness. Individuals with borderline personality disorder seek out intimacy, but are very hyper alert to any signs of rejection or not being valued. and tend toward insecure, ambivalent, or paranoid patterns in their relationships. 2 to 3% of the adult population. And yes, you do see overlap between multiple disorders. So you could have somebody who is borderline personality disorder and has another disorder as well. So people with borderline personality disorder will characteristically experience great distress, which they cannot easily control, and may subsequently engage in self-destructive behaviors as they do their best to cope with the highs and the lows. So for example, let's say your spouse forgets an anniversary. Yeah, you have a fight, you argue about it, they apologize, they bring you candy, or show up in a negligee. But for someone with BPD, they believe their spouse no longer loves them. They jump to the worst possible scenario, and they may accuse them of having an affair or wanting a divorce. The behavior can even escalate to self-harm, such as cutting or attempting suicide. On the right-hand side, you'll see a picture from the movie Fatal Attraction, starring Michael Douglas and Glenn Close. And this is a classic representation of borderline personality disorder. He has a one-night stand with someone he meets at a business conference. She thinks it's going to be happily ever after. And when he rejects her, she goes nutso. She kills the family pet, she tries to kill herself, she tries to kill his wife. It's just this escalating sense of, you will not ignore me, you will not abandon me. Then we have a histrionic personality disorder, and this is characterized by excessive emotionality and attention seeking. Their lives are literally filled with drama. They are uncomfortable when they are not the center of attention, and they often act quite flirtatiously or seductively and like to dress in a manner that draws attention to themselves. They are, as you would say, flamboyant, theatrical, often exhibiting an exaggerated degree of emotional expression. However, their emotional expression is often shallow and lacking in detail, which gives them the appearance of being very insincere and disingenuous. About 2% of general population. For American girls, most of us can remember back to being in 8th grade and what the girls' bathroom was like, and that's pretty much histrionic personality disorder. But keeping in mind that teenagers don't reflect a personality disorder. It's that over-the-top emotionality that is not consistent with the situation. Then we have narcissistic personality disorder. The word narcissistic comes from the name Narcissus from mythology, and you'll see in the top right a picture of Narcissus, who was a beautiful boy, and he looked into a pond one day and he saw his reflection, and he was so taken by his own appearance that he went to kiss himself in the pond and of course fell in and died. It is basically the old story of, if you love yourself too much, it may not always be a good thing. So narcissistic personality disorder is a long-term pattern of abnormal behavior characterized by exaggerated feelings of self-importance, an excessive need for admiration, and a lack of understanding others' feelings. It's all about you. You are self-centered, the belief that you are superior, you have the tendency to be very condescending to other people, and you have that overwhelming need to be the center of attention. The other characteristic you tend to see is a lack of empathy, which is the inability to recognize or identify with the feelings and needs of others. So what you do see is someone who engages in relationships that tend to be very superficial because it's all about increasing their self-esteem. So when they are looking for a romantic partner, they're looking for someone who's going to literally worship them. And when the person is done worshiping them, it's time to move on. Avoidant personality disorder is a condition characterized by a lifelong pattern of extreme shyness, feelings of inadequacy, and a sensitivity to rejection. This is 2 to 2.5% of the general population. Identity issues include low self-esteem, being socially inept, in other words, not being able to really connect with other people, excessive feelings of shame, self-direction issues, meaning they are reluctant to pursue goals, they're unwilling to take risks or try new activities that involve other people. They also are characterized by an impairment in interpersonal functioning, meaning they're preoccupied with and sensitive to criticism and rejection, and they are reluctant to engage in any type of relationship because they're afraid of being ridiculed. And for a lot of people, we have friends who are always busting on us or we bust on them, and it is a way of, expressing affection in a non-mushy kind of way. These folks take these kinds of false busting or false criticism as very real and very sincere, and that's oftentimes not the way it's intended. So they tend to avoid relationships. Then we have dependent personality disorder, and this refers to a pattern of being submissive, clingy, because they want to be taken care of. They want somebody to just take care of everything in their lives. They want to avoid conflict, so they don't stand up for themselves. They don't ever disagree or make an independent decisions, and are challenged to begin a task when nobody is available to assist them. They have an intense fear of losing a relationship, and it makes them vulnerable to people who are willing to abuse and manipulate them. So in this kind of a context, a dependent personality disorder isn't someone who's just can't decide what they want for dinner on a Saturday night. These are people who literally cannot make any decisions for themselves. They rely on their partner to make all decisions. And these folks also are unwilling to stand up for themselves because that might push the other person away. And that's their greatest fear. Obsessive-Compulsive personality disorder. Now, I just want to make sure you guys understand that obsessive-compulsive personality disorder is not the same thing as the anxiety disorder, OCD, or obsessive-compulsive disorder. That we're going to talk about in a different slideshow. This disorder, this personality disorder, is probably the one that you recognize as OCD, but it's not. It's a personality disorder. This personality disorder is characterized by a general pattern of concern, and when we say concern, we mean nutty concern, orderliness, perfectionism, excessive attention to details, mental and interpersonal control, a need for control over one's environment at the expense of flexibility, openness, and efficiency. This is pretty big in society. The estimates range from 2 to 7%. These are people who have to do it their way and their way only. Men are more often diagnosed with OCP, about twice as often as women. They also have a difficulty in understanding and appreciating the ideas, feelings, and behaviors of others. Their relationships are seen as secondary to their work, and the rigidity and stubbornness they exhibit affects their relationship with others. If you have somebody who will only do it their way and no other way is even considered, a lot of times you just stop dealing with that person because the frustration sometimes gets out of control. Other personality traits include compulsivity, meaning that everything has to be perfect. They will sacrifice deadlines in order to ensure that something is 100% accurate. And again, it's not about making sure that your paper is proofread. It's about making 75 drafts of your paper and still not feeling it's good enough. Belief that there's only one right way to accomplish something, and persistence at tasks long after the effort has ceased to be effective, efficient, or functional. At some point, you have to accept that something's not going to work and you have to just give up and move forward. These people have a really hard time with that. Now, how do we treat personality disorders? The main way is through psychotherapy, which is also that talk therapy. And during psychotherapy, you learn about your condition, you talk about your mood, your feelings, your thoughts, and behaviors with a mental health provider. Using the insight and knowledge you gain, you can learn healthy ways to manage your symptoms and reduce behaviors that interfere with your functioning and relationships. And it can take place with individual counseling, group counseling, and family counseling settings. Again, though, keep in mind that personality disorders are egocentric. People don't see their behavior as inappropriate. And until they get to the point where it's either pointed out to them to the extent that they're willing to make a change, they generally do not seek treatment. There's also medications. Now, there's no specific medication approved by the FDA to treat personality disorders. However, psychiatrists will often use a combination of antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds, mood stabilizers, or antipsychotics, any combination therein, to try and help people manage the symptoms. I've saved the antisocial personality disorder for last when we're talking about personality disorders because it does reflect a much different perspective than the other personality disorders we've discussed. Primarily because most of the others we've discussed can be irritating, can be traumatizing in a relationship, or can cause a person to really isolate themselves. People with antisocial personality disorder are dangerous, and it refers to a pattern of disregarding or violating the rights of others without guilt or remorse. It is approximately 3.5% of the population, and it's predominantly male, 3 times more common in men than women. Research has shown that most prisoners, violent prisoners, I'm not talking about the guy who sold a little too much drugs on the corner, or the guy who maybe killed his wife because he found out she was cheating on him. Those are not good reasons, but they're understandable reasons. Most prisoners who are violent meet the criteria of having antisocial personality disorder. We're talking 50 to 80% of prisoners. And it's also known as being a sociopath. They will harass, steal from, beat, destroy property, kidnap, or kill without any guilt. So these are the people who will literally steal grandma's last dollar and not have 1 ounce of regret. Some researchers have suggested that antisocial personality disorder is evident in high-level corporate executives such as CEOs. This is one of those conversations that is reflected in the research because a lot of times these CEOs make decisions that negatively impact their companies and the employees without feeling any remorse. For example, the top 3 guys at Enron, which was an energy company, basically destroyed the company and destroyed the pensions of all of their employees in order to make themselves richer. Now, a couple of them went to jail. One of them died before he went to jail. But if they didn't get caught, they would have been very successful corporate executives. And as a consequence, what we have to look at is somebody who just doesn't feel bad about something that they do that really hurts someone else. So the criteria is that the person is at least 18 years old. Self-esteem is derived from personal gain, power, and pleasure. Goal setting is based on personal gratification, so it's all about them. They have that lack of remorse, lack of empathy, lack of concern for others' feelings, but they are outstanding at faking remorse, especially when they're in court. Their relationships are based on exploitation, coercion, dominance, and intimidation. So somebody who is has antisocial personality disorder, they don't care what they have to do to control somebody because they don't feel bad about any of the negative consequences. They've looked at some of the psychosocial factors that contribute to antisocial personality disorder. In children, or during the childhood, what they see is people who grow up with antisocial personality disorder tend to have very poor parent-child interactions. There's a lot of truancy. They engage in excessive amounts of theft. I mean, shoplifting is the most common crime we see young people engage in, but this goes beyond. They tend to disobey their parents and they lie without remorse. And again, we don't diagnose this until they're at least 18 because teenagers in general engage in a lot of this behavior. Children who were abused sexually or physically are also very much at risk. A young person who is diagnosed with a conduct disorder when they're young is often considered the precursor to an antisocial personality disorder. A conduct disorder is someone whose behavior goes beyond the regular rambunctiousness of a child and is excessively inappropriate. The biological factors that contribute to antisocial personality disorder really focus in on the prefrontal cortex, which is where our impulse and decision making is really managed. MRI scans of the brain show that people with antisocial personality disorder have 11% fewer brain cells in their prefrontal cortex, which is the area that, again, is responsible for making decisions, planning, and managing their impulse control. Researchers have also hypothesized that damage or malformation of the prefrontal cortex increases the risk of antisocial personality disorder. What we've seen with the post-concussive syndrome in some of our professional athletes who have, been arrested for abusing their wives or children, or have murdered their spouse and killed themselves, is that this brain damage has a significant impact on their behavior. Treatment options for someone with antisocial personality disorder. There's not much. Psychotherapy is absolutely not effective. They love lying. They will sit with a psychotherapist and they will lie, make up any kind of story. They don't care because they fail to see their behavior as a bad thing. In other words, they don't want to change. They like who they are. Now, there are pharmaceutical treatments for antisocial personality disorder, such as antidepressants that raise the levels of serotonin. Some researchers believe that abnormality in serotonin levels may cause the impulsive and aggressive behaviors. So, what they do is they gave them medications that increased their serotonin levels, which then subsequently decreased their aggressive behaviors. However, the antisocial behavior returns because the patients stop taking these meds. And same thing with antipsychotics. They help decrease aggressiveness and impulsivity, But unless the person is mandated to take medications, for example, in a prison, they're not going to take them on their own because they like who they are. Remember the word egosyntonic, because that is the baseline for understanding these people don't want to change. So, what is the long-term prognosis for someone with an antisocial personality disorder? Well, it's not good news. In a 29-year study of 71 men who had antisocial personality disorder, it showed that 69% showed no improvement in their behavior. Now, this is over 30 years. So it's a long-term problem that needs to be managed. One of our more famous antisocial personality disorder representatives is Charles Manson. He led a cult that killed a bunch of people, and he was put in jail in the early 70s. He's still in prison, so still crazier than a loon, still ready to come out and kill people. Although he himself didn't kill people, he encouraged his followers to kill people. So he's been in prison for 45, 46 years, give or take, and he has shown no improvement in his behavior. So let's move on to defense mechanisms. Now, defense mechanisms are something that we all utilize on a regular basis. It does not mean we have a mental disorder. It does not mean we have a problem with our mental health. However, depending on the frequency of how often you use defense mechanisms, that will tell us if there's a mental health issue. So, in order to deal with stress and anxiety, people use defense mechanisms to help them cope. And although we are sometimes aware that we use them, in many cases, these defenses occur unconsciously and work to distort reality. While all defense mechanisms can be unhealthy, they're also adaptive, and they allow us to function normally. The greatest problems arise when defense mechanisms are overused in order to avoid dealing with problems. The most popular, and the one that most of us have a working knowledge of, is denial, which the old joke says it's more than a river in Egypt. This is used often to describe those who are unable to deal with reality or admit an obvious truth. So we will say, oh, he's in denial, she's in denial, especially when we see a relationship falling apart and one person is still committed and the other one has already checked out. Denial is an outright refusal to admit or recognize that something has occurred or is currently occurring. Drug addicts, alcoholics, often deny they have a problem, and victims of traumatic events may deny that the event ever occurred. A lot of times people will deny the traumatic event because it's easier than having to accept that it happened. So if someone is groped at the subway, or if someone is, their boyfriend or girlfriend gets a little rough with them, they move into a denial stage saying, no, we were just messing around or joking around. Denial functions to protect the mind from things that the individual cannot cope with. While this may save us from anxiety or pain, denial also requires a substantial investment of our energy. The next defense mechanism is repression, and this acts to keep information out of our conscious awareness. So repression, if you look at the picture on the right-hand side of the triangle, repression is about keeping things in our subconscious. We don't access them as memories, they are more, we've kind of checked out. We don't want to think about these things, so we've stopped thinking about them and we're able to literally repress our memories. The memories don't disappear, they continue to influence our behavior. So for example, a person who has repressed memories of abuse suffered as a child may later have difficulty forming relationships. Sometimes we do this consciously by forcing the unwanted information out of our awareness. And this is called suppression, not repression. Repression is unconscious or subconscious. Suppression is when we consciously push it away. Displacement is something that I'm sure all of us have experienced at one point with our kids or our spouse or with our parents. We come home after a really horrible day at work or school and we take our frustration out on our family and friends. This is displacement. Displacement involves taking out our frustrations, feelings, and impulses on people or objects that are less threatening. Displaced aggression is a common example. Rather than express our angers in ways that could lead to a negative consequence, like arguing with our boss, we instead express our anger towards a person or object that poses no threat, such as our spouse, our children, or our pets. So you go home, you yell at the cat, and you tell the cat he's a jerk, and the cat just sits there, stares at you, and licks its butt. Well, you're displacing your anger, but in a less threatening way, because the cat's not going to care what you're saying. When we displace our anger onto our spouse or our children, then it does have negative consequences for our home life. There's something called sublimation, which is actually a really good defense mechanism, and it allows us to act out unacceptable impulses by converting these behaviors into a more acceptable form. So, for example, if you're really angry or pissed off about something at work, you should go take up something like kickboxing, and that'll help you vent your frustration. A lot of people choose to go to the gym after work to rid themselves of the frustrations that occur while they're at work. Psychologists believe that sublimation is a sign of maturity because it allows people to function normally in socially acceptable ways. So instead of punching your boss, you're punching a heavy bag at the gym. Projection is a defense mechanism that involves taking our own unacceptable qualities or feelings and ascribing them to other people. So, for example, if you have a strong dislike for someone, you might instead believe that he or she does not like you. So if your friend says, hey, we should call Mary or Joe or Tamika and have them join us, you say, Tamika doesn't like me. And your friend's like, what do you mean? She's awesome. She totally likes you. And you personally do not like Tamika, but you say, no, I really don't get that she likes me. So let's just skip that and go out just us. Projection functions to allow the expression of the desire impulse, but in a way the mind cannot recognize, therefore reducing our anxiety. So, yeah, we don't like Tamika, but we're not going to say that to somebody who might like her, so instead we're going to project that onto Tamika, not liking ourselves. Intellectualization works to reduce anxiety by thinking about events in a cold, clinical way. This defense mechanism allows us to avoid thinking about the stressful, emotional aspect of the situation, and instead we focus only on the intellectual issues. So, for example, let's say you go to the doctor and the doctor says, I have very bad news for you. You are dying. You have about 3 months to live. And instead of going home and crying or freaking out or calling everybody you know to tell them, you go online, you start creating lists of information about your disease, you start putting together a list of where all your belongings are going to end up. So instead of dealing with the emotion of a situation, you're dealing with the facts and the process that are involved. And you're basically postponing having to deal with the emotions of it. Then there's rationalization. We love to rationalize, and I love this little cartoon on the right. So Girl Scout cookie season is the season for rationalization. And the guy in the purple shirt says, if I eat the whole box now, then I won't be tempted to eat them later. Okay. Of course, the fact of the matter is there's 3 more boxes in the pantry and he'll be eating all of them. And he won't have that swimmer's body anymore. So rationalization is a defense mechanism that involves explaining an unacceptable behavior or feeling in a rational or logical manner, thus avoiding the true explanation for the behavior. So, for example, a person who is turned down for a date might rationalize the situation by saying they weren't attracted to the other person anyway, or a student who blames a poor exam score on the instructor rather than on his or her lack of studying or preparation. Rationalization not only prevents our anxiety, it also protects self-esteem and self-image. So when confronted by success or failure, people tend to attribute achievement to their own qualities, while failures are blamed on other people or outside forces. So for example, whatever football team loses the Super Bowl, always the players, when they're interviewed, tend to say things like, well, it just wasn't our year. And the other team are just playing better than us. And what they're doing is they're rationalizing their loss because they can't say, we were terrible on that field, because that's not something that their ego is going to let them say. Then we have regression. And for those of us who have children, this is pretty familiar, especially when we have our second child and the first child starts to act more babyish because they see the baby getting all the attention. So with regression, when we're confronted by a stressful event, people sometimes abandon coping strategies and revert to patterns of behavior used earlier in development. So, for example, an individual fixated at an earlier developmental stage might cry or sulk upon hearing unpleasant news. This defense mechanism is often paralleled to Freud's developmental stages. Behaviors associated with regression can vary greatly depending on which stage the person is fixated at. Now, keeping in mind that Freud is only a developmental theory, it's not fact. So don't take this as 100% gospel. So an individual fixated at the oral stage might begin eating or smoking excessively, or might become verbally aggressive when faced with behaviors or issues that they don't want to deal with. A fixation at the anal stage might result in excessive tidiness or messiness. And when you think about it, a lot of people find great satisfaction that when they're stressed out, they open up their junk drawer, empty it all out, throw out half the stuff, organize the junk drawer, and then move on with their day feeling better. So, it's not necessarily exclusively a Freudian idea as much as how do we help ourselves feel better in a productive way. So then there are other defense mechanisms which are not quite as complicated. We have acting out. The individual copes with stress by engaging in actions rather than reflecting upon internal feelings. You're really pissed off about something and you punch the wall. Well, you're acting out like a 3-year-old. Other people, they find out that their partner has cheated on them, so they go to a bar and they pick up the first person they get to and they have sex with them in a car because they want to get back at their partner. Then there's avoidance, which is refusing to deal with or encounter unpleasant objects or situations. It's a little different than denial because, for example, if we are stressed out or feel anxiety about going to work, we will oftentimes call out sick for a couple days. We call them mental health days. And it's not necessarily a bad thing to do that because it does help us regain some perspective. It's when you call out 37 times in a row and the company fires you that it becomes a problem. Compensation is when you overachieve in one area to compensate for failures in another. So, for example, there's a football player who plays for the Eagles named Darren Sproles, who's no taller than 5'6", and this guy is an awesome player. He is surrounded by guys who are at least a foot taller than him and 100 pounds heavier than him, but give him the ball and he's going to go for it, and he is just a terrific player. And you could say he's compensating for his small size by being an outstanding technician on the field. You also see, for example, people who are extremely intelligent, and you look at them and they are just not cute. So you kind of think, well, they've really focused in on their education because they know they're not very attractive looking. One of the most famous examples of compensation is Napoleon Bonaparte, who was a French general. He called himself an emperor of Europe. He tried to take over all of Europe, and of course he failed when he got to Russia. Here's a hint: never try to take over Russia in the winter. But he was 5'1", 5'2", and historians have always said that he overcompensated with his militaristic excellence because he was so much smaller than the average soldier. And then finally we have humor, which is pointing out the funny or ironic aspects of a situation. So one of my favorite examples of this is from the movie Young Frankenstein, starring Gene Wilder and Madeline Kahn and Terry Garr. It's a great movie if you haven't seen it. But there's a scene where Dr. Frankenstein and Igor are digging up a dead body. And it's disgusting work, it's hard work, they're sweating, and Dr. Frankenstein is complaining about how gross this kind of work is, and Igor says, hey, it could be worse. It could be raining. Which is a funny thing in and of itself, but the fact that it then consequently starts raining immediately as he says that makes it even funnier. So, when we look at humor, a lot of times it's meant to alleviate the tension of a situation. Finally, we have what's called passive aggression. And passive aggression is a combination of a negative attitude and inactivity. So this is the person who's going to constantly complain, but they never do anything to improve their situation. And it is characterized by learned helplessness. Now, what is learned helplessness? Learned helplessness is when you experience a person who is just helpless. They want to make a sandwich. Do we have bread? Yes, it's in the pantry. Do we have peanut butter? Yes, it's in the pantry. Do we have jelly? Yes, it's in the fridge. Where do I find a plate? And they go to the extent of being to the point where it's just easier for you to get up and make them the sandwich. Well, they act helpless because they've learned that being helpless will force others to take care of them. And it makes them understand that if they continue to act helpless, others will show up and take care of them. These folks also have a very careless attitude about being on time. They don't care about deadlines. They are often feeling like the victim of someone else's unfair treatment, and they invent ways to create conflict with those closest to them because ultimately they fear intimacy. So they tend to pick fights over dumb stuff because at the same time they want someone to take care of them, they also don't really feel comfortable with intimacy. They refuse to take responsibility for their own actions, and worse yet, want others punished. So there's a number of causes behind the development of somebody with passive aggressive traits. The most probable are growing up in a family or social atmosphere where not much importance is given to an individual's needs and wants, where expressing personal desires is not accepted and is taken as selfish and self-centered behavior. We see this in a lot of cultures where women are expected to sacrifice of themselves for their spouse and for their children. So you'll see mom who may be sick as a dog, but she's still up cooking dinner, getting the laundry done, and when the husband says, "Here, I'll help," she's like, "No, no, I'll take care of it." Now, part of that is cultural. Women are often taught this. But to recognize this as an unhealthy behavior and also understand that the spouse is willing to help or the kids can be willing to help is an important factor in overcoming this kind of behavior. So, that is it for this PowerPoint. If you have any questions, please email or text me, and I hope you have a fabulous day. Thank you.